So it's a bit of a ball ache, but I'm just focusing on the business for the time being and
Yeah.
trying to get that to a decent level and trying to maintain that as I resume the PhD. So
Yeah.
it's, how about yourself? How's yours going? That business and everything?
Yeah, pretty good. Recently brought on another coach, which was nice, and kind of Mike Israetel's coming over at the end of May, so it's kind of that's kind of the forefront of just trying to fill out as many of the seats as we can. So no, good. It's fun being kind of self-employed, but also kind of a lot of pressure. Like my girlfriend was like, "Are you taking the Monday bank holiday off?" I was like, "I didn't even think about it. I'm just
Yeah,
working."
bank holidays don't count do when you're self-employed. But yeah, how was the last one? Because he might came over last year, didn't he?
Yeah,
Around, was it May time again?
yeah.
Was it?
I mean, it was good, but I think we only sold maybe 20 tickets or 25 tickets, which is really not very good. We still actually made money in the end because we charged.
Yeah,
It was quite expensive compared to what they seem to be now. But this time we've already sold, I think, over 50 tickets. So, and his popularity's grown massively since then as well,
yeah,
and my own. So,
yeah. He has got a good. Yeah, you can always tell by the amount of likes someone gets on Facebook as a measure. He must get over 1,000 quite often. So I don't think I've hit 1,000 yet. I think the most I've got was around 400. So
but
um,
your infographics and like your Facebook posts, the ones I've seen at least that get shared, and then I end up seeing them like really spot on. They're really
yeah,
good.
cheers, mate. Yeah, appreciate that. Yes, likewise to you as well. I don't know if you've made everyone, but from the ones that you do see, and I think that's the key, isn't it? Because it's all well and good understanding it, but then how do you relay that onto someone who hasn't really got a clue about science
Yeah,
and how it works? And yeah, I think I do that reasonably well. I think everyone could do better at it, but it's better than just sort of speaking complete jargon and then yeah, just being completely unfamiliar with what you've got to say. But still, but back to the seminars, I think because they're quite regular now, aren't they? Like, but when Alan Aragon came over, and we had him over in 2013, that was the first time he'd been
yeah,
out of the US, and like now he's probably on the road
all the
six,
time.
7 times a year. Yeah, I think he's in Amsterdam next week or next month or something, and then in Australia, and yeah, it must. So the cost got to come down because the more people see him, they're exposed to it. Because I think the first time when he came over, it was a bit like a celebrity, and they wanted
A
to see
hundred
him.
percent.
Whereas now it's sort of expected in a way, isn't it? So you can't really charge the sort of £300-400
Yeah,
because people won't pay it, and people might, but then the most you'll ever get is about 90 or 100 or something, I think.
mm.
And,
And
and then again, the evidence based community is pretty small, especially the ones that are going to travel and
yeah,
commit to going. Like, I haven't seen anything over 150 in the UK in terms of like even the Epic Summit. I think was about 90 or something,
mm.
which that's at the same time as Body Power in Birmingham, so massively publicised, and it shows you how few people are. Yeah, it's quite depressing that we're actually not reaching that many people. But
Yeah, it is. And
oh,
then I guess because also there's so many, like we're doing this podcast and I do the podcast with Mike quite regularly. It's kind of like, well, there's so much free info out there now, so it's almost like, do you like commit to going? But I think when people go, they realize it's not about being there to see the information necessarily. It's about being there and connecting, and the kind of it
yeah,
makes you love the industry again.
yeah. Like every time I go, you get that sort of kick up the arse and think, especially if you see James Krieg and you think, but yeah,
Oh,
makes you feel stupid, doesn't it? But yeah, it's good. It's good to see everyone in person. And
yeah,
it's a lot different, isn't it? Because Facebook's like, I think people pretend like not necessarily pretend, but they come off differently than in person and stuff. And like it's refreshing when they're sort of normal because there's a lot of weird personalities on Facebook and then they're normal in real life and then vice versa. So
yeah. I try and I think you're the same. I think we're pretty much the same online as offline, but like I know just off the top of my, like Mike Samuels is a really good writer, and online he comes across as quite like confident and like quite outgoing and talkative, and then in person he's quite actually subdued and quiet. So, but yeah, you can be who you want online. So
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose if people are paying him for copywriting, that's what they'll judge him on. So,
oh yeah,
yeah, he doesn't need to talk well. He doesn't need to necessarily be able to present extraordinarily well. I'm naturally probably not the best presenter, but I think my writing's my stronger point. And yeah, some people are different, and yeah, it's what makes it interesting, I guess, isn't it? Like how people, because I think most of us have got the same sort of message, and people following. Like I'll be sort of singing off the same hymn sheet as Alan and Stu Phillips and all those guys around protein, and so you could follow any one of us really, and you'll get pretty much the same information. But I suppose people gravitate towards something that's a bit more fitting with how they learn, I suppose. So that's probably the use of different people. But, so what did you want to discuss today? Because I know I sent over that worksheet.
I have actually got something cool I think would be good, and I just wanted to check, do you have a time limit? Kind of, is an hour okay? So if we finish around 5?
I've got nothing on till about 6, so
okay,
that's fine.
Cool. What I was thinking is, I just thought a title would be quite nice of perfecting your protein intake. So I know you've got kind of the hierarchy of just overall kind of hierarchy for nutrition for massing or gaining muscle. I thought we could just kind of maybe just specialize and go the hierarchy of protein, because it mainly is protein. The calories is kind of, it's a surplus, but maybe just diving into the elements, so total protein, and then looking into different populations, how it might change, protein distribution, talking about MPS versus MPB, and kind of all of that area, and then quality, go into the considerations for vegetarians and vegans, and maybe just looking into that aspect. And then timing, we could go into casein protein then, and also maybe talk a bit about peri-workout nutrition if that comes into it at all.
Yeah, sounds good to me, mate. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it will be a nice break. I could see this as an article, but you may have written one very, very similar. So
yeah, no, it's like a sort of because I'm working on one, sort of trying to like optimize a sort of per meal dose of protein. The thing is, I think if you summarize your thoughts on it, you could probably say it in less than a paragraph, but we will sort of delve into a little bit, because essentially what you can do is, if you consume enough protein and distribute that throughout the waking hours, that's pretty much anyone needs to do.
Yeah.
And if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, maybe just go slightly higher on the protein, but we can get into all the sort of nitty gritty with that, and geek out a little bit on some of the science, especially around casein's getting a bit more popular now. Did you follow that? What's his name? Jorn Tromelin, is it?
Yeah, I heard him recently on, I think it was on Danny's podcast. He was talking about pre-bed protein, which was interesting to hear his thoughts. I think he said it's good to have a higher dose then, but it doesn't matter that it's casein or if it's whey or whatever. And I thought that was surprising.
Yeah, I think it's that's probably one of the only points in terms of like an optimal dose, that you probably do a little bit better with a higher amount pre-bed, because there's a paper that they've done, I don't think we've published it yet, where it was 30 grams of, I think that was casein taken pre-bed with or without 2 grams of leucine. That was it didn't improve overnight protein synthesis, so it seems as though 40 grams would be the minimum there. And I know Jose Antonio used 55 in their study, but it's it's quite interesting, especially like all of the stuff around protein breakdown as well. And we'll get into that anyway. Cool. when we get started. But
and just to let you know, I'll end it saying bye, but it'll be bye to the audience, and then we can kind of close off.
Then just cut off.
Just because it's only happened with Brad Schoenfeld, where I said bye and then
he just
I was like, fine. Cool. And I'll introduce yourself, and if you want to add it, I'll just let you kind of, if you want to add anything more, because I know I introduced Lyle McDonald, and then he was like, I want to expand on this, so he wanted to say some more. Cool.
Yeah, that's cool.
Awesome. Welcome, guys, to the Macros Bodybuilding and Powerlifting podcast. I am your host, Steve Hall, and I have another great guest with us today, and that is Joseph Agu, who hopefully a lot of you may have heard of, some of you might not have. I for sure have been following him for quite a while, and we've met a few times at various conferences that we're just talking about how they've just expanded, which is really cool. And also he's been doing a lot of work online with Facebook and putting out great infographics. So hopefully you've seen some of those. If you haven't, and if you haven't heard of Joseph, he is a performance nutritionist. And he used to work with the British athletics team, so he certainly knows his stuff and has currently been working more with elite nutrition not elite nutrition mentoring. I'm thinking of something else. Elite nutrition coaching. So that is his own brand, ENC. So he has completed a BSc in sport and exercise science, also an MSc in sports nutrition, and currently working towards his PhD. Which we just spoke about, and is kind of a bit on hold, so he's got more time to put into his business, which is cool, but obviously still very much in the research, doing lots of work, especially around protein and nutritional intervention for kind of strength and performance athletes. So is there anything else you want to add to that, Joseph? I know I kind of rattled through.
Just in terms of if people want to find that, so on Facebook, it's facebook.com/Joseph Agu Nutrition, or one word. And the website's elitenutritioncoaching.com.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll make sure all of the kind of your social media links and your website's down below, because there are many great articles on there, and kind of they probably delve into a lot of the specifics we're going to talk about if people want to kind of get a reference point. So if we delve straight into it, we want to talk about kind of perfecting your protein intake, and obviously kind of perfecting something is very kind of elusive. It's like trying to find something that's optimal. It kind of depends on many things, but if we just take it from kind of a scientific perspective and kind of take out the variables that life throws at us, we can kind of come to a roundabout way of recommending things. And Joseph had a great way of breaking down kind of the hierarchy of your protein needs and kind of the things to focus on, and then once you kind of hit that level, you can focus on the next level, kind of like a pyramid. That included total protein, protein distribution, quality, and timing. So we're going to kind of try and go through each bit, break it down for you, and Joseph kind of knows this stuff really well, so I'm excited to kind of give this to you guys. So if we start off with kind of total protein intake, and kind of why is that most important? What kind of figures should people be aiming for? If there may be, and differences maybe between their energy intake, maybe if they're in a surplus, deficit, and just maintenance. Would that change, Joseph?
Yes, thanks for the introduction. So, yeah, it's part of an article I wrote on casein or protein ingestion pre-bed. That was in 2015 for the Alan Outgoing Research Review, and then did that as a separate blog post last year. So I think that went up in May 2016. I did like a hierarchy in terms of protein, basically. So what is the most important factors to focus on? So at the bottom, so looking at the most important to the least important, I had total protein intake. So that's a total daily protein intake. The second one was distribution, then quality, and then timing. So in terms of total protein intake, it's been studied for probably about 25 years or so now. I think one of the first reviews on protein requirements for strength athletes was by Lemon in 91, and they suggested a range of around 1.4 to 2.2, around 2.2 grams per kilo of body mass per day. And to be honest, that hasn't really changed that much in the past 20 years. So I did a graph in one of my Facebook posts, actually, where I basically looked at the different ranges and how they've changed over the years. And it is pretty linear in terms of a general line across. But then where it does change is a couple of reviews. So there's one, Phillips and Van Loo in 2011, and then Eric Helms' one looking at protein recommendations during caloric restriction, and they sort of suggest going upwards of the sort of 2 grams per kilo mark and going up to around the sort of 2.5 to 2.7. The Phillips paper slightly less. So, and the idea is that during dieting, that you're more likely to lose muscle. So providing the body with extra amino acids would help minimize muscle loss, essentially. There's some evidence to suggest that's the case, but there isn't really any evidence to say going quite so high is beneficial, at least in terms of providing protein to minimize muscle loss. There's some evidence that consuming a higher protein might help with satiety, which is obviously important during dieting. So that'd be something to consider. But in general, my general recommendations are around 2 to 2.5 grams per kilo per day. So the lower end for those who are at maintenance or probably in a surplus, and the higher end as you're getting a bit more aggressive in terms of dieting.
Awesome. And then kind of considerations, are there any differences for age? Because I know kind of the younger populations tend to be able to survive on less, essentially, or do with less, and then elderly people need a bit more. Is that something you've seen in the literature to be true?
Yeah, so there's a concept called sarcopenia, where it's basically an age-related decline in muscle mass, and part of that is a decreased sensitivity to, I think, one, exercise, and two, the amino acids that you're ingesting. So if you look at the dose required to get a near maximal increase in muscle protein synthesis, that is significantly higher in older people compared to the young. So most data indicates that around 20% is probably around the optimal, whereas 40 grams in the elderly population would be probably a bit more appropriate, sort of 30 to 40 grams. So that said, there's a study that came out last year by I think Oliver Whiteard's group. So that was a 2016 paper where they showed that 40 grams of protein in young subjects was better than 20, so significantly better, which is in contrast to some of the early work. There was a paper in 2009 by Moore where they showed that there was no significant difference between 20 and 40 grams. And the main key difference between those designs really is the type of exercise done. So in the Moore paper, as well as another Whiteard paper in 2014, they used, I think it was just leg extension, so like a single limb or single muscle group exercise, whereas the 2016 was a full body exercise session. So the idea is then if you're using more muscle mass during that exercise period, so for a given workout, then you could probably do with a little bit more to really maximize that anabolic response to a single meal. That said, it's not as though the 40 grams has suddenly come out of nowhere, because if you look at the difference between the 20 and 40 gram response in the Moore paper in 2009, I think the difference is around 10%, and it's probably around 20% in the more recent Whiteard paper. So you're getting 80% of the effect with 20 grams anyway. So it is the more economical dose. It's just that for those who are looking to really push the envelope, then probably going a little bit above that is worth it. So my general recommendations are around 30 to 40 grams for most people. For women who perhaps might be a little bit lighter, then maybe around the 25 gram mark, but that's mainly to be able to include sort of regular amount of feedings within a given protein intake. So for example, if we've got a 60 kilo woman, if they're consuming 2 grams per kilo, that's 120 grams. So if then they were to consume 40 grams per meal, that's only 3 feedings throughout the day, whereas ideally you'd probably want around 4 to 5. So in that instance, sort of 4, you could probably get away, well, you could do 4 30-gram doses, for example, and that'd probably be slightly better than the 340. But in reality, it's probably not going to make that much difference, but it just makes that distribution a little bit easier. And some people prefer it, and it can't be understated the importance of preference that comes into this as well, because it's all well and good to say to someone that you need to eat 4 to 5 meals a day with 30 to 40 grams of protein in each one, whereas some people, me including, that I prefer to eat a few like say 3 larger meals. So my meals probably contain about 50, 60 grams of
Hmm.
protein in each one. In terms of maximizing anabolism, it's probably not ideal, but I'm probably getting over 90% of the effect of what nutrition is going to have. And training is going to play a much bigger role in hypertrophy anyway than just eating protein. Someone could eat the perfect sort of protein setup, and if they don't train at all, they probably won't really gain anything
Hmm.
unless they're coming from a really suboptimal intake. Whereas if they're training relatively poor, they're still not going to get great results just because the training is obviously the limiting factor, really.
Hmm. So yeah, no, it's a good kind of summary, and in terms of preference being key is absolutely true. And I think there's many things to take on board when you're talking about kind of total protein intake and kind of thinking about your situation. Because I know I've even got clients, I've got, like you said, smaller females where their like required total protein intake might be quite low, but they like to eat fairly frequently through the week, through the day even, and they're on a fairly low intake, so they maybe kind of want more for satiety reasons, or even people who are kind of in a surplus and they're quite small males, so their protein intake kind of on that basis looks quite small, but because they're eating so much, they actually really like to have that higher protein intake. And as long as they're getting sufficient, I think the key is with those sort of situations is if they're making sure they're getting enough kind of fats and carbs that it's not limiting their progress, because that can become quite an important factor as well. Just on the side note with the protein intake, when you do it with clients or just your general recommendations, are you basing that off lean body mass or kind of total body weight?
Um, Total body weight more often than not. Um, well, I can't recall ever doing it by lean body mass. One, because most of the clients are online, so getting an accurate estimate of body composition is going to be difficult.
Hmm.
Um, for those who are quite overweight, then say if someone's 120 kilos, for example, I'm not going to stick them on 240 grams of
Yeah.
protein, because if you factor that into the lean body mass, you're talking well over the sort of 3 gram mark. Um, so yeah, as long as you're quite pragmatic about it. So if we take someone who's 120 kilos and say if they lean down, they'd probably end up being about 85. Then I'd probably put them around the sort of 150, 160 gram mark. So um, probably around 1.8 to 2 grams of their sort of lean body weight, if you like. So it's taken into account lean body mass in a way, um, but if you say if you were to hire me as a coach, then it'd just be pretty much a straight 2.2 grams per kilo more,
Hmm.
rather than factoring in your fat mass, just because obviously there won't be much judging by some of the pictures you've seen. So
Yeah, I hope so. I think the protein and total protein has come to quite a nice point at which the kind of the golden rule or golden rule of thumb of 1 gram per pound, which is really easy for people to remember, is quite a nice kind of ground that covers most bases, even when people are in a surplus, a deficit. And then if they want to consider, okay, I'm slightly older, so maybe if I want to optimize things a bit more, I can go a bit higher. I'm in a deficit, I'm quite hungry, maybe I can go a bit higher, or vice versa. If you're in a surplus, you can go a bit lower. But getting around that 2.2 per gram or the 1 gram per pound, yeah, sounds like a great recommendation. And like that's the starting point for anyone listening. Kind of, if you're not doing that, it doesn't matter if you listen to the rest of the podcast, you get the rest of the things right. If you get this one wrong, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. Just like if you're not training, you're shooting yourself in the foot big time. So if we move on to protein distribution, which we kind of touched on a little bit, you talked about spreading it through. You like to have the 3 bigger meals, but you touched on maybe 4 to 5 meals being maybe more optimal. How many meals is too many? How many meals do you think is too few? Are people shooting themselves in the foot by doing intermittent fasting a little bit? Maybe delve into that a little touch.
yeah, so let's go for muscle gain first of all. So the goal of optimizing muscle hypertrophy in terms of nutrition, it basically comes down to trying to stimulate muscle protein synthesis as much as you can in a given day. And probably the best way to do that really is if you take a given protein intake of say 2.2 grams per kilo. Just spreading that evenly across the waking hours of, so it usually works out around 30 to 40 grams in most males, probably slightly lower in females, and in consuming that, say, over, say, 16 hours. So I think I've got some examples somewhere. But yeah, it's relative. So if we take, say, an 80 kilo male, for example, then 2 grams per kilo is going to be 160 grams. If you did 4 intakes of 40 grams for that a day, so maybe at breakfast, then pre-workout, post-workout, and then dinner, so a late dinner, that would pretty much take care of the protein synthesis, providing that something's consumed relatively close to bed, and then providing something's consumed relatively early on, so breakfast within an hour of waking or something. There's not going to be a significantly long time whereby you're not consuming protein, maybe 8 hours or so, which is typical of most people's sleep patterns. So if you were to do 5 meals, so then you could do, say, 7, 11, then say 3, and so on. You could, so I think 4 to 5 meals every 4 to 5 hours is about right for most people. It's easy to remember as well, that sort of 4 to 5 mark. And the thing is as well, so when you get over about 2 or 3 meals, there probably isn't going to be that much of a greater impact in terms of the additional meals anyway. So for someone who's doing intermittent fasting, I don't understand why anyone would really do that for the goal of muscle growth, especially if they're trying to optimize it. People still grow well on intermittent fasting. So if someone was to, say, do a 16-8 fast, so they're eating for 8 hours in that day, they could, say, eat at midday, then 4 p.m., then 8 p.m., and then fast for 16 hours. You can still gain muscle quite well on that. I did that for a little while when I was just quite busy in university and stuff like that, and it came down to the point where I was sort of, is it worth spending 20 minutes prepping a meal, or 20 minutes prepping a meal or something like that? And I prefer to do some reading or some work. So, and it just makes my mornings a bit more productive as well. So I can just have a straight run then until the first meal, rather than messing about first thing with breakfast and stuff. You can just get a pot of coffee and then run with it. So
no, that's sorry, go on.
And then in terms of fat loss and muscle maintenance, there doesn't seem to be that much evidence that you need to go to the same high meal frequency as if you were to gain muscle. There was a review of positions done by the JSSN. I can't remember which year it was. It might have been 2009 or 2011. And they basically came to the conclusion that providing you're hitting your daily protein intake, you could go as little as 2 meals a day and sort of maintain muscle mass. But then obviously if you're trying to eat 160 grams, it's going to be difficult to do that in 2 meals. So you're sort of almost forced to consume at least 3 meals anyway. So that would be my 2 cents on it. And then there's the issue of protein timing as well. So if you are consuming 4 to 5 meals over the course of the waking hours, then your protein timing is almost going to be optimized as well by default. Because if you look at post-exercise nutrition, there's not going to be more than 4 to 5 hours that passes between meals anyway. So as long as you're training between one of those time slots, which you obviously would be unless you have a meal during your workout, then there's no evidence to suggest that that's going to be detrimental, that you need sort of protein within an hour of finishing a workout. There's a study, I think it was 2000, I think it might have been 2009, and they showed that delaying or consuming protein an hour after exercise or 3 hours after exercise resulted in the same stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, because when you do train, your muscles are more sensitive to the incoming amino acids for up to 3 days. They'll probably peak around the 24-hour mark. So the anabolic window is days rather than minutes, as a lot of people are led to believe. And you see people shaking the shakers in the gym, ready to consume as quickly as possible. But So then if we take casein intake as well, so there's gathering data now on casein in particular pre-bed. I think it can be beneficial for some people, but it tends to only be beneficial, or would seem to only be beneficial for those who aren't consuming something or consuming protein in close proximity to sleep. If you were to consume, say, 4 or 5 meals every 4 to 5 hours, you'd be by default doing that. So you wouldn't really need any additional protein on top of that. Because the study, or the main one that's been done in that area is 2015. That was by Van Loon's research group. So they got subjects to ingest, I think it was 27.5 grams of a casein blend plus 15 grams of carbs. That was about 30 minutes before sleep. And then that was compared to a non-caloric placebo. So it was protein and carbs versus nothing. And then over the 12 weeks, the subjects consuming the casein had greater increases in cross-sectional area in type 1 and 2 muscle fibers and improved the total 1RM. So I think that was across a few movements. But probably the main limitation of that study is that it compared protein against nothing. So what you're essentially comparing is the sort of bottom end of the protein recommendations against the higher end. But even then, it's difficult to separate whether it's the additional protein that's having an effect or whether it's purely the timing aspect. And in reality, it's probably going to be a bit of both. Because if we look at, and this was a good point that I think Jorn Tromelin made, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and a review on casein last year. And this is going back to a meta-analysis in 2012 by Cermak and colleagues, and they found that out of the studies where they've compared or supplemented protein with resistance exercise over 6 weeks, only 5 out of the 16 studies showed improvements in fat-free mass. This was in young men, so I excluded the old men in my sort of mini analysis, just so you're not sort of skewing things based on that sort of anabolic resistance to a degree. So you could make a point that because they did see an effect, then it leans slightly towards sort of saying, yeah, timing does have an effect, and it does to the extent I think that you're just consuming protein and it's just basically another feeding window. But probably an argument against that is that out of those studies, only 5 measured, I think, cross-sectional area of the muscle. And 3 of those 5 showed improvements with the protein supplementation. So, so it sort of goes against that point in a way, because the more sensitive the measure, then you're more likely to see an effect with added protein. So it isn't as dismal as, say, 5 out of 16 would lead you to believe. And even in the Van Loon study, they didn't notice an increase in fat-free mass. What they did notice was a significant increase in the cross-sectional area. So with a more sensitive measure, then you're likely to see that. So it comes back to the idea that it's probably a bit of both going on in terms of timing and the total amount. And there was a paper done, it was published this year by Jose Antonio. So they did a relatively similar study. So they looked at the effects of consuming casein. So it was around 55 grams within an hour and a half before sleep versus in the morning. And over the 8 weeks, they didn't see any differences in body composition. So when protein was matched in this case, then there was no difference. Although both groups increased their lean body mass. The morning group increased it by 0.4 kilos, and the other increased it by the sort of casein before bed increased it by 1.2. Whether that's down to the chance that I suppose that study would need to be replicated to sort of further elucidate what's going on, but there might be a very slight effect for timing, but then again, that would be probably negated by just distributing protein properly. So I think total protein and then distributing that are the 2 main factors to be concerned with when it comes to protein and optimizing muscle hypertrophy.
Perfect. So if you're getting your total protein, which we've done, And then we've talked about every 4 to 5 hours, which means basically 4 to 5 servings of protein through the day if you're splitting that. And we want to pretty much split that evenly. You don't want to, you're kind of talking about, you don't want to see someone having like half their protein intake within one of those meals and then spreading the rest through. I know we've talked about MPS, which is muscle protein synthesis, and I know you've written about kind of, is there a minimum amount we need to maximize that? Because if we are talking about optimizing things, we definitely want to maximize that every time. And is there an amount where if you have any more, it's kind of like, well, it's not really doing anything but taking more time to digest. You're not actually getting a better MPS increase, and that's why the distribution and the even distribution is quite important.
Yeah, that's right. And then there was another paper, I think it came out in 2013 or early 2014. This was in the elderly, I think. So I think they consume the majority of protein at dinner in one group and then smaller amounts at breakfast and lunch. And that was outperformed by consuming the same protein and then distributing that evenly across meals. And there was a 2013 paper as well by Arota and colleagues. And they split 80 grams of whey across 8 doses, so 8 times 10, 4 times 20, and then 2 times 40. And they found that the 4 times 20 produced the most robust increase in protein synthesis. So it does seem as though there's an advantage to sort of spreading that out to a degree to get sort of more frequent spikes, if you like, in muscle protein synthesis. But then again, that was an isolated source of protein, and they were fasted coming into that. So in the more practical scenario, if someone's consuming more of a mixed meals and protein sources that aren't as rapidly digested as whey, then it's likely that those increases aren't going to be as robust and probably will sort of merge into one almost. So it matters to a degree, but probably not as important as the sort of data would lead you to believe. I think as long as you're consuming the total amount and then having that sort of reasonably split across those meals, it doesn't matter. So if you miss one of those time points and then double up at, say, at a different time, I think the differences would be minute, and you wouldn't be able to detect those in research anyway.
Yeah. I guess some of these, because they are such minute differences, it will take long-term studies across multiple years to kind of fathom out the tiny increase in maybe muscle mass that you could potentially be gaining. And then you'd have to be in such a controlled environment for all the other factors. It would be almost impossible to ever represent.
Yeah, I think the only way you could do that is if you're looking at more of the mechanistic side. So because protein synthesis, so if you look exclusively at muscle protein synthesis, that is quite a good predictor of muscle mass gain. So I suppose if you vary those, but as soon as you start using different protein sources and mixed meals, then a lot of these effects are gonna diminish. So you could actually make an argument for that going above even, say, 3 meals isn't going to be that much more beneficial. But if you're really looking to optimize things, then it's best to sort of go a bit overboard and trying to do a bit more than is necessary to sort of get to that end goal. It always feels nice when knowing you're doing everything in your power. And I think that's where a lot of the bro sciences come from, because they do over and above, and they're strict to the extent that a lot of the stuff they're doing is unnecessary. So, but it makes people feel better when you are doing more. It sort of gives you that sort of that placebo almost that you're doing more, and in reality your body's responding equally as well to someone who's a lot more relaxed in their approach.
No, I think that's not that it's related, but it's kind of quite we could go way off topic, but believing in the process, and kind of if you think you're doing something that is better or the best, then you're going to get better results. If you believe like the program you're doing is the most effective, optimal program ever, you're going to get better results, because it's weird how that works out, but there's a lot of psychology involved.
Yeah, I'd say it probably come down to the training side of things. So if they really believe their programs, the dog's bollocks, shall we say, then you're probably going to work a bit harder doing that. You're probably going to be a bit more strict with your diet, and that will probably bear out bear out better results. I think if everything physically was matched, then yeah, it'd be interesting if belief actually produced better results. I don't think it would, but it wouldn't surprise me just because some of the sort of research on placebo and stuff is really fascinating, especially around pain and like using sham pain relief and stuff, and people that feel fine and it performs equally as well to like an actual pain relief. But yeah, we're going quite off topic.
But I think if any of our clients are listening, just believe that we've given you the dog's bollocks of programs. We've given you the kitchen sink, so you'll get the best results that way. Just believe in it. So I think we covered really well total protein intake. Now we've distributed it. The next thing we want to consider is the quality. And I know that is quite important because obviously we have this leucine threshold. People hear about leucine thrown all over the place. If you want to touch on kind of the considerations that people might want to take when they're talking about quality, I know a lot of I've spoken about with kind of smaller guys who are bulking, and they get a lot of their protein from like bagels and which is the gluten, I'm assuming, and things like this, and whether they need to think about maybe I should increase my protein intake so I can get some higher quality with that because it's not got that much leucine, and whether leucine on its own is obviously also not enough. You need kind of the whole protein there to allow the whole process to go through. But without me kind of mishmashing it all together, I'll let you kind of talk and delve into the importance of quality for people.
Yeah, sure. So generally when we speak of quality in terms of promoting muscle gain, we're speaking of the sort of leucine and the essential amino acid profile of a given protein source. So if we look at animal proteins, they tend to be a lot better than vegetarian and vegan sources. They're a lot higher in leucine, they're a lot higher in essential amino acids. So you touched on the idea of a leucine threshold, and that's tied into what we're talking about in terms of an optimal dose. So there isn't, in fact, an actual threshold because even 10 grams of whey will produce like a protein synthesis response, probably around 65-70% of that of 40 grams. It sort of levels off like that almost. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Moore 2009 paper, you can see that quite nicely. So, well, in terms of maximizing that response, you're probably looking at a protein dose containing around 2 to 3 grams of leucine. So if we go with the upper end of that, so really trying to push the boundary, that would probably work out as around 25 grams or so of whey, probably close to 13 casein. Milk could be somewhere between the middle, and then a little bit higher stuff like chicken and beef, and then fishes, you need a little bit higher amount than that. But then if you're looking at sort of vegan sources, then you can be talking close to sort of 40 to 45 grams to get that sort of 3 grams of leucine in that. Wow. In that given protein dose. But I suppose a strategy that you could do it, if so, for vegan or vegetarian bodybuilders, then there's two options really. You can either go slightly higher with your overall protein, so which you discussed earlier on, or you can add leucine to that given protein dose. And I'm not sure if that's been done today. I'm sure they've done fortification of protein. I think it might have been wheat protein with leucine. Okay. And it performs sort of similarly well, from what I recall, unless I'm getting things mixed up. So there's two options there. And speaking to Lee Hamilton, I think they're producing some research in this area where they're fortifying some vegan and vegetarian or some vegan sources with leucine and seeing the response. And then I think comparing those to, say, whey, which is probably the best protein source out there. There's nothing that really matches it in terms of the leucine content as well as the absorption profile. It's just rapidly absorbed in comparison to other protein sources. So that would be how I'd adjust things based on a vegetarian. But even if a vegetarian ate or a vegan ate 25, 30 grams of a given protein source, if you compared that to someone who's eating meat and completely unrestricted in their choice of protein sources, then you probably wouldn't be too disadvantaged by it. um, even at the sort of 1.8 to 2 grams. So, but just to sort of cover your bases and to really trying to push the boundary in terms of muscle growth, then it doesn't hurt to say increase, say, total protein by maybe 10%. So if you're consuming 2 grams, go for 2.2. And that would reflect then in those given protein doses throughout the day. So that's one way of doing it.
Cool. So we're talking about, a lot of people kind of, they focus on MPS and they almost think about if they don't have a certain amount, they're not getting anything from it. But obviously we've just touched on, it's not that you're not getting anything from it, you're just not getting maximal, you're not maximizing your MPS. So is there a certain amount that different people, when we are talking about maximizing your MPS, I know some people I've heard talk about recommendations per meal in terms of kind of a gram per body weight, or 20 grams for kind of younger guys, 40 grams for older guys. What is your kind of view on maximizing MPS on a per meal basis?
I can't recall any. I don't think there's any data showing that going above 40 grams is beneficial for muscle protein synthesis. So that would be an absolute maximum, unless there's more data out there. But even then, even if there was a slight advantage of a little bit more, then is that worth? Is it better to distribute that 40 across 5 meals or 4 meals versus having, say, 60 at 3? I'd probably guess not. So I still don't see any real rationale of going above that. In terms of a minimum, I'd say it comes down to the protein source again, but I'd say around 30 to 40 grams would be sufficient for most people. If you're consuming, say, whey, then you could probably get away with 20, or even 15 if you're quite a light woman. What was the other part of the question? About
it was.
Oh, what do I recommend it in terms of the? Because most people are familiar with it, I just recommend it in grams or even down to the sort of serving of protein. So, say for a chicken breast, for example, that's around. Well, you can get some quite big chicken breasts now, so which are towards about 50 grams of protein. But in, say, like a typical Tesco one like that, then you're probably talking around 25 grams or so. So if you give people who are not really familiar with grams and stuff, if I give just an average client, say, consume 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per meal, they'd probably stop working with me. So, but, I don't think there's much advantage to recommending it per kilogram, because there was I think in that Whitehead study in 2016, they showed that individuals with higher lean body mass didn't respond any differently for those who were lower lean body mass. So it doesn't seem as though it's impacted much by total muscle mass, which makes sense in a way, because essentially protein acts as the signal to stimulate that. And if you think about the total protein, it's actually being incorporated into new muscle. It's a very small amount of the actual protein you consume in a given day. So, so part of the reason why we recommend lower for, say, women is because then it doesn't make a massive. So if you give a woman who's 55, 60 kilos, 180 grams of protein per day, it doesn't leave that much for other macronutrients and stuff. So it generally scales with body weight, and that comes in that sort of, that's mainly sort of dictated by the total daily amount of protein anyway. So I think between 20 and 40 grams is probably going to be fine for most people. For the elderly, probably getting up towards the top end of that for sort of lighter people, and even light males, like when you get some men in sort of the low 60s, high 50s, then probably 20 to 25 if it's a high quality protein source would be fine.
Perfect. Yeah, I think the really nice thing with that is when you do just cover your total protein and then you get it split between the 4 to 5 meals, you've kind of covered that scenario and problem anyway, and so it becomes something that you don't really need to think about too hard, which is a really good thing. And then I think if we've kind of gone through total protein distribution and quality, now we can talk about timing. And I know we've already touched a bit about casein and potentially the timing of that pre-bed. I remember when I went back in the day, and when I first got into kind of talking about nutrition for bodybuilders, I remember them talking about casein. It like globulates and it drip feeds protein through the night, which keeps your muscle kind of growing through the night, and then that kind of got like shooed away, and now it's kind of coming back. Whether a casein before bed is a beneficial thing. Has there been a lot of kind of good quality research on this, or is a lot of it still kind of theoretical? What are your thoughts on casein before bed?
So going back to so we discussed it slightly earlier on. So I think it can be useful if, so you're not consuming protein in close proximity to bed anyway. If protein was properly distributed, then I don't think there'd be much need for, or if any need to consuming casein or any other protein for that matter pre-bed, because you'd pretty much be already doing so. And like you say, casein is a slowly digesting protein. So when it's in the stomach, it coagulates, and then like you say, so the gastric emptying is pretty slow. So the rate at which it empties from the stomach, and then that reflects in the absorption profile of. So if you did whey, it's more of a rapid sort of increase, and more of a robust increase in protein synthesis, whereas casein is a bit more slow to rise and sort of slower to fall. So it does suit nighttime feeding. But a lot of other proteins have got a similar property anyway. And I think if you could consume 40 grams of whey before bed, I don't think there'd be any difference between, say, whey versus casein in terms of sort of long-term effects on muscle growth, for example. So the research that has been done into it, and most of this has come from Luc van Loon's lab, and I think it's Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And one of the first ones they did was they fed casein via a nasogastric tube. So that's a tube that goes up your nose and down the throat into the stomach. And they showed that stimulated muscle protein synthesis overnight, and I think that was 40 grams of protein. Obviously, that's not relevant to your listeners. So they did a similar study, but then subjects ingested that. So they ingested 40 grams 30 minutes before sleep, and showed that improved overnight recovery. So what it compared to a placebo, that increased protein synthesis. So it's essentially, I think it was around 22% or something like that. So that was essentially designed as a proof of concept, because there is some evidence that the diurnal effects are just the effects of just like your circadian rhythm on digestion and stuff that can be impaired slightly during sleep. So it's basically to say that, yeah, you can still absorb and increase protein synthesis during sleep. So then you think, oh, that opens up a whole new window for people to try to exploit. And people have been doing that for years. You've got bodybuilders wake up in the middle of the night and down a protein shake, which should probably work similarly well. But I think that's going a bit overboard. And I think it's fine if someone was a competitor and that's like a pro bodybuilder, then you're trying to do everything you can for that sort of fraction of a percent. But for your average gym goer, then you're talking a less than 1% effect of that, of such a practice. So what they did after that study, so that was the one I previously discussed, where they used 27.5 grams of casein, a casein blend before bed, and that outperformed a placebo over 12 weeks in terms of the cross-sectional area, and then the muscle cross-sectional area. And then the more recent one was the Ozzy Antonio one, where they matched protein and then consumed either 55 grams of casein at breakfast or before bed, and then found that there's no difference statistically. There's a very slight advantage in terms of consuming the casein, but so I think that's pretty much where we're up to in terms of the research at the minute. I think what would be a good study is looking at, say, 24-hour or maybe 36-hour muscle protein synthesis in response to matched protein intakes across the day, because it is difficult to tease out any changes in long-term studies, and there's so many limitations unless you sort of people are completely adherent. They're doing exactly what you say. and they've got everything controlled. It just costs a lot of money to do that sort of stuff. It still costs a lot of money to do um, purely lab-based experiments and more acute experiments, but at least you've got that element of control there, and at least then I think looking at those mode markers would give us a bit of an insight. So if you did a similar one, say protein match, but then protein consumed one in the evening versus, so similar to the one, so the RES study in 2012, so where they consumed 40 grams before sleep and looked at overnight protein response, they could potentially do that over a prolonged period throughout the day and then sort of match protein with that. I don't know how feasible that would be in the lab. It'd probably be quite expensive. I suppose it means taking biopsies off people as well, so throughout most of the day. But yeah, I think it comes back to that. If you're consuming enough protein and you're not sort of going too long a period without it throughout the day, so you're consuming protein in the morning and then something relatively close to bed, I don't think it'd matter too much. One interesting thing, though, is that there does seem to be a sort of a dose response of protein pre-sleep as well. So going back to Jorn Tromelin, is in a review he did on sort of pre-bed protein, I don't think this has been published, but that they found that 30 grams didn't improve overnight protein synthesis compared to imagine a placebo. So maybe the 40 grams is a sort of minimum if you want to consume that pre-sleep. So maybe sort of 30, then up to sort of 40 to 50 in the evening. So which sort of marries up with what most people do anyway. People have generally more protein in the dinner because they have big dinners, and it's a bit more of a social meal than just trying to get something down throughout the day when people are busy. So yeah, but that's pretty much it in terms of casein at the minute.
And then in terms of timing, is there anything people need to consider? I know we talked about it a little bit, how the post-workout window isn't really a window, it's like days. Is there anything people need to consider in terms of kind of peri-workout nutrition, in terms of protein timing there? If the general trainee doesn't need to, but what if someone's training maybe twice a day? Do they need to then consider it more so?
My sort of general opinion on, so go once a day first of all. So I think if you are consuming, so I think as long as no more than say 4 or 5 hours passes between protein feedings and your workouts sandwiched in between one of those, I don't think sliding the protein up or down either side of that workout is going to make any difference whatsoever in terms of muscle growth. If you're training twice a day, assuming that those bouts would be separated by at least 8 hours, you'd imagine if there's morning and evening training, that'd naturally fall in within that sort of nice sort of distribution anyway. So again, I don't think it matters too much. What I think would matter more is the intake of, say, carbohydrate in relation to training. So because we know that delaying the intake of carbohydrate can delay the replenishment of muscle glycogen. So after the first workout, then I'd say get as many carbs in as you can, as long as you're not sort of bloated and feel like crap, and it's within your sort of daily limit as soon as possible after a workout. And that could be done with, say, like a dextrose plus whey. So suppose then you're having a protein shake relatively quickly, but that would be pretty much my 2 pence on in terms of timing.
Perfect. No, that's really nice. And I think what's really nice here is, and if I can try and sort of summarize it, and you can correct me if I say anything wrong, is that once you've got your total protein correct, you've distributed it between 4 to 5 meals fairly evenly, and maybe back-ending a bit more in the evening, so making that evening serving slightly bigger. And if you're not vegetarian and you're consuming enough protein, you're probably getting a good enough quality each time. You've kind of covered all your bases right there and then, and you don't need to really worry about it any more than what you have. And I think for most people, it's not even that difficult to do what we've just described and like laid out to people. Yet a lot of people, obviously, it's great having the research into it. And I think, like we discussed, it's really hard to pick out the little nuances that could potentially be beneficial. But as the overarching principles, the biggest rocks have been shown kind of quite clear with the research. It's really a fantastic place to be.
Yeah, that's spot on. Yeah, it's quite nice. And it's probably better than my ramblings for the past 45 minutes. um, yeah, like I couldn't agree more with that. And I think with that, when you're talking about more sort of complex issues and this stuff kind of about protein timing and then casein and then people like all these, say, branched chain amino acids and leucine and stuff, I think people get overwhelmed, especially people who don't really understand science um, or read much into it, and probably just the information they get is from like bodybuilding magazines or sort of the more popular YouTube channels, i.e., less evidence based.
Yeah.
Then you can be misled and sort of miss the forest for the trees, and then the forest essentially is the total protein, and then just. And I think even if you said to someone consume 2 grams per kilo of protein per day, I think by default they'd nail over 90% of their stuff because they'd be forced essentially to distribute that. And some of that will come in close proximity to training and probably the bed as well. So even that one simple bit of advice, and then for every little layer on top of that, you just add in that little tiny bit more. So that's pretty much my thoughts on it.
No, brilliant. I really enjoyed that, and I think the listeners will have really, really taken a lot away from it. And to go back to your point about your ramblings and the research and everything, that's very important, and that's how we can come to these summaries, because you do all that work, which is greatly appreciated. Anyone who's listening loves building muscle, and they need this stuff. So no, thank you very much for doing that. And I want to make sure that the audience know where they can reach out to you. I know we went over your links beforehand, but if there was any way you were kind of one place you wanted to direct people to, where would you say is the best place?
I'd say the more frequent updates I should really pull my finger out and do more blogging. I've got a few articles that are nearly finished, but
brilliant.
I tend to be quite a perfectionist, so I'm going to finish those off pretty soon. But facebook.com/Joseph Agu Nutrition. If you just type Joseph Agu or Elite Nutrition Coaching into Facebook, then you should be able to find the page. I probably do about 3 or 4 posts a week on that, and try and keep them as relevant and as interesting as possible. And then, so I'll be blogging a lot more as well this year, and potentially even some videos, maybe a YouTube channel, but I won't get ahead of myself just yet. And the website's www.elitenutritioncoaching.com.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely check out Joseph's Facebook page. And I know Joseph's actually you have these pages where if you ask a question or if you have a comment, they don't respond, but Joseph definitely does. He takes care of everyone. And if you have got questions there, I know not to get loads of people and traffic your way too much that you can't handle, but I know you're good and you'll get back to people and really, really helpful. So I definitely recommend people check that out. And again, just want to thank everyone for listening. I want to thank Joseph again for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot, mate. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.